On behalf of Economic and Political Weekly, I would like to welcome all of you for this live webinar today. So today's webinar titled Ambedkar's Retrieval of the Tradition of Critique in India. In India is in brackets. So we'll get to why it is in brackets later in the discussion. Is in continuation with the webinar that was organized by EPW on 11th of April, which was called Critique as Tradition, Explorations of Dissent in Anti-Caste Thought. So through both of these webinars, what we are trying to do is that we are trying to explore certain traditions of critique in India and elsewhere, which can be brought to bear for thinking differently about questions of hegemony as well as domination, again, in India and elsewhere. Our attempt in both of these webinars has been and will be to articulate such ideas which have a universal appeal in thinking about liberty, equality, fraternity, justice, democracy, etc., even if they might have emerged in particular historical contexts. So this relation between what is universal and what is particular is really important for both of these discussions, that the one that we had earlier and the one we'll be having now. And I'm sure both of our speakers will have some very insightful things to say about the relationship between what is the universal and what is the particular. So I'll briefly introduce both of our panelists for today. So Professor Valerian Rodrigues has taught at Mangalore University, Karnataka, and Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. His recent books include The Essential Writings of B.R. Ambedkar, so a book which all of us have read very closely. The Indian Parliament, A Democracy at Work, which was co-authored with B.L. Shankar. Speaking for Karnataka, which was co-authored with Rajendra Channi, Natraj Huliar, and S. Jaffet. And he had recently edited a very wonderful, collection of lectures, which was titled Conversations with Ambedkar, 10 Ambedkar Memorial Lectures, and it was published in 2019. Currently, Professor Rodrigues is the Jawaharlal Nehru Fellow at Nehru Memorial Trust, New Delhi. So now I'll introduce Professor Gopal Guru. So Professor Guru has taught at Savitribai Phule Pune University, Delhi University, and Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi in the past. He is the author of certain acclaimed titles, such as The Cracked Mirror, an Indian debate on experience and theory, and Experience, Caste, and the Everyday Social. Both these books co-authored with Professor Sundar Sarukai. And he was the editor of the volume titled Humiliation, Claims and Contexts, and the recently released title Spheres of Injustice with Albina Shakil, which was just launched in 2023. And since 2018, he has been the editor of Economic and Political Weekly. So with that, I'll just, very briefly tell all of you the format of today's discussion. So both of our panelists will be providing their opening statements of 10 to 12 minutes each. After that, we'll have a free-flowing discussion between both the panelists and myself on certain questions that we thought were relevant for today's theme. And after that, we'll open the floor for questions and answers for everyone concerned. And this is a request to everybody to please keep your videos off during the course of the discussion. And please put your questions or comments in the chat box that has been provided. You can put your questions and comments throughout the discussion. So with that, I would like to invite Professor Rodrigues to please give his opening statement. Professor Rodrigues, you can please speak now.
Thank you, Ankit, for that introduction. I wish to thank at the outset Professor Gopal Guru and Divya for inviting me to this webinar. It's a great occasion because EPW has been, a school of learning and also training during my lifetime. I wish to make the following 4 issues right at the start. But all these things are worded in large generalities. I don't think at this stage I would be able to give illustrations or develop the argument. First is that we need to locate Ambedkar's retrieval of the tradition of critique in the nationalist discourse, in the context of nationalist discourse, particularly the Oriental and nationalist law. And he attempted to reach out not merely to texts and traditions through his intervention, but also redefine what I believe a distinct epistemic and political map. Some of the most important critiques that he engaged in the process were Mahatma Gandhi, Bal Gangadhar Tilak, Nehru, and even Allama Iqbal. The second point that I want to make, Ambedkar was deeply aware of the tradition of Bhashya and Tika in India, and how Bhashyas of Sri Shankara, Sri Ramanuja, and Sri Madhva, particularly on Badrayana's Brahma Sutras, had shaped modern Hinduism. Tilak opens it up in Gita Rahasya, but we find Ambedkar's distinct take on these issues. The third, of course, he was influenced by the West, but we will come back to that later. And comparative grounds of whatever he has, either with French philosophies, etc., we can discuss later. The third point that I wish to highlight is the substantive dimensions of the critique that he disclosed before us or he worked on. The first one, and within the third, the first one, Ambedkar argued that frameworks of understanding indelibly mark our understanding. So our access to knowledge is premised on our frameworks of understanding. But he went further. This point, of course, has been made by several scholars today, but he went further and argued that these frameworks of understanding are invariably caught with the moral templates that we take overboard. And therefore, any kind of reconstitution of understanding also involves reconstituting our moral dispositions. The third, he argued, we see the world through these frameworks and moral template. We have no direct access to texts, but we access the text through our moral sympathies on one hand and frameworks of understanding on the other. You can see this very strongly in the way Ambedkar approaches Tilak, or for that matter, others. Ambedkar, of course, emphasized very strongly that our understanding cannot be anthropological. It cannot be what he called, in his word, positivist. Our understanding is closely bound with the value question. Next one, our experience has a deep bearing in shaping the frameworks of our understanding and the moral radar that we propose or we highlight. However, our understanding is subject to intersubjective scrutiny. And this is something which Ambedkar emphasized very strongly. And the epistemic status of democracy lies there. However, at the same time, while intersubjective understanding is important, there is always in intersubjective relations an asymmetry of power or asymmetry of power. And this asymmetry of power can affect any kind of serious scrutiny. And the last point, while working on culture and text, what we seek to pursue is validity rather than truth. And Ambedkar thought that the way people were parading ideas of truth can lead to a great deal of authoritarianism on grounds of the past. At the same time, Ambedkar thought that all understanding and moral dispositions involve a very close study and a very critical study of everything that is available to us. And this disposition of encompassing learning is something which is central to Ambedkar. And I will have more to say on this. The fourth point that I want to make, that this template of critique that Ambedkar advanced depended upon certain metaphysical, and to some extent, epistemic basics. The first one is change is the law of life. And this he repeated earlier, not necessarily in the Buddha and his Dhamma, but we constantly find it in his writings. The second one, we approach the past from the present rather than leave our present as stipulated by our past. And here Ambedkar's arguments are original, but at the same time, he extensively quotes Dewey in this regard. But I don't think we can actually collapse, like some people do, Ambedkar's arguments here to that of Dewey. Dewey becomes an authority, but an authority to be acknowledged rather than reduce his extensive writings on this issue. The third issue that metaphysical issue that we see, as beings, we constitute and reconstitute ourselves through engagement with others. And suppose I use this term, sociality, therefore, is something which is central to human agency. And the fourth assumption that he makes, he doesn't dwell on these issues. He dwells, of course, on the constitution of the self, how we are constituted, etc., through, by engagement with others. But there are some of these issues, like changes in the law of life. He refers to it in several places, but does not necessarily go to argue on this. Now, for Ambedkar, if we are constituted through our interactions with others, and if we approach the past through the present, there is a responsibility that lies on all of us. And this factor of responsibility is something that recurs in Ambedkar always. Responsibility which is premised on serious reflectivity and connectivity to others. And the last point that I want to make is language constitutes us and opens and debars access to traditions and resources. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Rodrigues, for that tour de force, I might say, a very dense and rich philosophical overview of some of the core tenets of Ambedkar's not only thinking but his method of looking at the world. So that was really insightful, and I'm sure we'll have much more to talk about your thesis in the discussion. So now I'll invite Professor Guru to give his opening statement. Professor Guru, you can speak now.
Yeah, so thank you very much, Ankit, for your introduction. And also, I take this opportunity to thank Professor Rodrigues for having made such an important statement, opening statement, reflecting on very complex ideas that are there incipient in Ambedkar, but he has made able attempt to really reveal to us what is so significant in Ambedkar and what is escaping our attention thus far. Well, thank you, Value, for a very important intervention. I would like to promise that there will be some overlap. There could be some kind of intertextuality between what I am saying and what Professor Rodrigues has said. So let's start with the main theme of the webinar. Tradition, which is important for understanding and transcendence, critique is internal to such tradition. In fact, being critical is an essence, in fact, metaphysical essence of such tradition. Such an essence permeates in Ambedkar's writings till Buddha and his Dhamma. Traditions, however, do not become critical on their own, but the critical essence of such tradition needs to be revealed through interpretations that are rigorous and not rhetorical. And I would like to take this opportunity to quote Valerian's very important work, Making Tradition Critical, where Dr. Rodrigues has given us a very rigorous account of the interplay of arguments in that particular. I mean, it's such a dense article which was written some times ago, and I don't think many people have really taken care to really refer to it. That's why I think they have relied on rhetoric rather than rigor. So I think that I would like to put on record that the most important article that I have come across so far is this, which actually is full of rigor. So the tradition of thoughts thus involves critical inheritance or appropriation of emancipatory impulses from the ideas in the past. The ideas that have emerged in the historical past but remain to be relevant today. So what Professor Rodrigues was saying about looking at the past through present actually has some reference here. Since those like Ambedkar are in need of building metaphysics of emancipation, one is bound to search for traditions that are continuously critical across time and spaces. And therefore we have Buddha, Kabir, Phule, and other. In fact, his cognitive graphs and his creative leap is expansive even crossing the boundaries of the West and reaching to the West. And I agree with Rodrigues for his reflection on Dewey. Dewey has to be acknowledged, not to be reused. I'm just actually reaffirming what Valerian has said. It is in this sense, in Ambedkar's intellectual tradition, what is contemporary is also the past, and what is past is also simultaneously contemporary. this is again talking to what Valerian was saying. This is because the questions are perennially important to address. Since the questions are perennial, the past has to be continuously present in our imagination and in our agential intervention. Intellectual traditions which are critical in their emancipatory thrust are not dissociative but associative. They are mediative rather than repudiating. They do not progress through the disabling binaries such as either or. And this Mars or Ambedkar that was extrapolated later. They are mediating in that they do not forge and foster an ontological gap in the thoughts and ideas. And Ambedkar in his writing avoids this ontological gap. In Ambedkar's writing and speeches and his reflections, there doesn't seem to be any ontological gap between what he thought and wrote, and for whom he wrote and thought. It is critical and hence ethically appealing to heads, I mean the conscience, and what Valerian was saying, the moral reflections, and does not go overhead. It is actually appeal to the head, does not go overhead. It is thus contemporary as well as classical because the questions are perennial. I am repeating this point. Ambedkar's audience is in the present as well as it is going to be in the future, depending on the existence of the questions that actually trouble the emancipatory project. Ambedkar has thought and wrote in order to facilitate ordinary synchronic communication. And I think there's some reference to Gramsci here. That would consciously avoid communicating only to the elites, but establishing communication with common masses. So that is this synchronic communication that he actually has, and reference to what Value was saying is reference to language is important here. Of course, he would use different language and style when he was dealing with opponents like Britishers and opponents and like Tilak and others. The content of communication was always clear and clearly critical. In this context, it is all the more important to make reference to a very rich debate in the vernacular or mother tongue. Since I am familiar with the debates in Marathi, this is the tradition that is associative in nature and essentially fulfills the need for synchronic communication. So I'll just make one reference to Maphuwa, Mars Phule Ambedkar by Sharad Patil. So the rich debate that we have actually experienced in Marathi is really very deep, and we have to actually pay some attention to actually bring it into the common domain of understanding and analysis. However, in my opinion, one should not only look at the emancipatory tradition for their associative significance, because this focus on outward resemblance of emancipatory promises that may be there, for example, in March and Ambedkar or Gandhi and Ambedkar. In the context of this, in the context of the hostile tension that is created between these pairs by their defenders, both the Marxist, Ambedkarite, and Gandhian, it is necessary to shift our focus on the ethical modes of approaching these thinkers, because the ethical necessity removes the rough edges that a particular sectarian critic may carry with it. And this is the last point which will actually converse with the last point Valerian has made. So I must actually stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Guru, for adding on to the philosophical richness of Professor Rodrigues' statement by, again, continuing that thread of the method really that comes into play in Ambedkar's way of looking at the world and interpreting the world. There are many questions here that I jotted down in the course of both of your opening statements, and I'll begin with something that both of the speakers hinted at, which is the question of one's inheritances and how does one approach one's inheritances, because inheritances are always in a way forced and like they are handed over to us in a sense. But both these speakers pointed out to the importance of interpreting and looking critically at one's own inheritances. So we all know that Ambedkar's father was a Kabir Panthi, and in terms of his own community, like the Mahar community in Maharashtra, a section of the Mahars were also, influenced by or were attracted to the thinking of the saint Chokha Meda. So um, I wish to ask both of the speakers about the broader relationship that Ambedkar shared with the Bhakti movement, because we know that Ambedkar cited Kabir as one of his gurus among Buddha and Phule, but Ambedkar's relationship with Kabir and Chokha Meda is actually not very well known, mainly due to the paucity or lack of textual references to Kabir and Chokha Meda both in Ambedkar's writings and speeches. Um, so the question is to both the speakers: how do we evaluate Ambedkar's relationship with the Bhakti movement at large, and what kind of textual and archival sources will have to be consulted in that regard? So, Professor Rodrigues, if you want to answer that first.
Yeah, there are two questions. The first one is, how do we actually reach out to our inheritance? Um, and quickly, one or two sentences there, but I would come back to the main questions on Bhakti. Give me 2 or 3 minutes on this. There are millions of elements of inheritance, and they are constantly being recreated. How did Baba Sahib Ambedkar approach this question of inheritance? We choose elements of inheritance that we regard as significant, particularly through the lens of our experiences initially. However, through educative processes and intersubjective relationships, we revamp and begin to correct ourselves and reach out to other dimensions to the extent that I constitute it as my inheritance. And the largest that I reach to a democratic community of the widest scale, greater would be my way of critically processing inheritance. This would be Ambedkar's. Now, coming back to something like his relationship to Chokha Mela, and there's some work on that. I think Selianor opened up the issue in a big way. There are other people who have done some work on that. But Ambedkar's relationship to Kabir is a very complex relationship. It is a relationship which I believe personally was mediated through a version of Kabir that Ramji Sakba bequeathed to him directly, rather than the Kabir that was made available in the public sphere in India in late 19th century. And it is important for us to see how Ramji Sakba begins to reconstruct the Kabir for him. And here, Kabir that is available to Ambedkar, or Ambedkar celebrated, I feel, he tried to distance him from the Ramanandi traditions. And to that extent, the Bhakti movement that was tracing itself to the Ramanandi tradition. This is one dimension which I want to suggest. The other dimension, which I think is problematic in Baba Sahib Ambedkar, the problematic dimension is the way he actually began to treat the entire Bhakti and the complex Bhakti tradition as something which is reaching out to the transcendental rather than recreating our world for us. Now, largely this statement is true, and there are other people who subsequently have done enormous work there. But Baba Sahib Ambedkar, to the extent that he acknowledged that norms are important and even spiritual equality is an important consideration because it can become an anchor to put up a fight. Here, I think the Bhakti traditions are absolutely important, I feel, and Baba Sahib Ambedkar did not pay adequate attention to it, partly because probably it was not his central concern, partly because I think he wanted to pull an argument in a different direction. Sometimes people say it's not that Marx forgot about the significance of the superstructures, but he wanted forcefully to draw our attention to the economic domain and therefore the kind of major writings that he undertook. Similarly, given the significance of bhakti in the public domain and the kind of delusions it can create, Ambedkar thought that this is quite important too. And then I personally subscribe to the position that Ambedkar never believed seriously that there is something called Atman and there is something called Brahma, which actually begin to constitute the norms for our lives. What he believed in is the idea of self-perfection. And self-perfection can be achieved only through a particular social order. And he saw self-perfection as embodied in the Buddha as the direction towards which everyone should march. Yeah.
Was really helpful. I mean, thank you so much for that. Professor Guru, you can answer this question.
Okay, thank you. I think what Valerian has said is important. It is an important consideration for those who actually latch on everything. I mean, put everything on I wouldn't say burden, everything on Ambedkar's intellectual mapping. But I think we should actually accept that, as Valerian has very rightly said, that his main concern was to really work out the adequate theory for understanding exploitation, discrimination, and emancipation. Economics, of course, then becomes one central concern. Politics, economics, law, everything, but not so much bhakti. But we can always. The second difficulty that we have is that we don't have a very large or detailed text that Baba Sahib has written on either Kabir or even Phule. So we will have to do some kind of interpretative homework. And I mean, this is risky. The suggestion itself is risky because, all those guys will say, what business you got to be interpreting. But Baba Sahib himself has adopted this method, and we are not deviating from him. I think the approach to history of ideas will help us to actually relate Ambedkar to Kabir and to Phule, because the critical tradition will invariably deal with the history of truth, and history of truth comes through speeches, oral traditions, and textual tradition as well. And this starts from Buddha onwards. Now, if Kabir is also dealing with history of truth, whether it is transcendental or even concrete, we will have to Kabir becomes available through this historical reading of Kabir. And Baba Sahib actually is doing this because he considers history as the method of pedagogy, the narratives through which you can process truth. And therefore, when you read his speeches that he delivered to common masses, he would always use his Kabir, Food, and every other saint, particularly Tukaram, and Tukaram actually, and his Mukhanayak and also Bhaishkul Bharat, they all start with Tukaram's template. So I think there is this resource of history as pedagogy of processing and narrating, communicating truth across times and spaces. This is one. The other one is also has to be kept in mind that Baba Sahib was following certain kind of historical conventions. That if you really want to oppose Brahmanism, Tukaram is the best resource to actually deal with this. And therefore, I think constant references to Tukaram becomes eminent in Ambedkar's writing. So I think that it may be factually true that there are no written text on these, but we can make connections between Baba Sahib and all these dissenting traditions, because they actually deal with the questions that is historically perennial.
Thank you, Professor Guru. Again, like I also want to attest to the importance of some of the Bhakti saints that even if they don't recur in Ambedkar's writings, they're very much present, I suppose, in some of his thoughts. As you mentioned, of course, the masthead of Mukhanayak and Bhaishkrut Bharat very much had verses from Tukaram. So Bhakti tradition is very much latent in Ambedkar as a critical tradition as well. So since we've gone into the realm of historical retrieval as well, this is somewhat of a straw man question that comes up again and again. So I want to just put it before you so that we can get some kind of a headway towards answering it rationally. So when it comes to Ambedkar's conversion to Buddhism and some of his historiographical investigations as well, like who were the Shudras and the untouchables, who were they and why they became untouchables, one hears a certain charge or accusation of Ambedkar indulging in so-called mythography, where he wanted to construct an identity, and that identity is portrayed as being fictitious by some, of modern untouchables as being erstwhile Buddhists. So do you think that in the act of retrieving critical traditions from the past, which Professor Guru underlined is in a way a risky endeavor, and linking that critical tradition with the fate of the untouchables in modern India, Ambedkar was indulging in quote unquote irrational or dogmatic frames of thinking, in a way compromising with certain tenets of reason and historical validity. I mean, this is something that is regularly charged against his historiographical books like Who Were the Shudras and the Untouchables. Professor Rodrigues, please.
Yeah. Before I reflect a little, Ankit, on this question, let me just say something on what Gopal has just said about our rejigging history. Ambedkar was very careful when he used words, and he doesn't go around announcing that Buddha, Kabir, and Phule were his gurus, but he does that in a couple of places. And when you use the term guru, particularly in the non-Brahminical traditions, you immediately begin to locate yourself within a particular kind of lineage. both a cultural and spiritual lineage. And you don't have to announce it all the time that I'm a Shishya of so and so, because that is something which constantly lives in you and becomes creative in you. And eventually, like normally people do in India, their achievements, but they come and tell all your ashirwad, you know, because of your blessings. Now, you obviously know that, these blessings were not there as instrumental reasoning, but there was this canopy in which you situated yourself. And for Ambedkar, I think this way of looking at history and relating to it, I think is quite important. Now, coming back to your question about these two texts that he wrote on the Shudras and the untouchables. The texts were published immediately after independence, but Ambedkar wrote furiously, and sometimes uh, all over the place. So he must have collated these particular texts somewhere immediately after independence and the arguments. I made a statement on this. I may want to make a personal action. And I said that these two books that were published in the aftermath of independence have to be seen politically rather than as a substantive piece of research. Today, I would use instead of political, methodological. These two books have to be seen methodologically rather than substantively. Now, what is methodological? Methodologically is trying to propose the way you want to investigate an issue which is seriously in doubt, and a lot of scholars are not prepared to enter into. So these two texts are open-ended texts rather than identity creating texts like the ones that we see all the places. Therefore, Ambedkar thinks that a long introduction on methodology is absolutely important for these texts. And if you see these texts, there is a long drawn methodology. Why is he investigating the untouchable question the way he does? And I think he would be quite happy if it was combated by somebody else, showing why this horrible kind of a social institution, the most demeaning that humankind has ever seen, rose in India. And this is a perplexing question. How could a civilization tolerate this? And Baba Sahib therefore goes into this. And he thought that the nationalist public in India were not prepared to engage with this question, and he wanted to throw it at the nationalist public that had come up. And I don't want to name here Nehru. The way Nehru, for instance, approaches the problem of untouchability. And definitely Ambedkar wanted to pass on a message. Look here, this is something much more demeaning. This cannot be captured in the framework that you are proposing in the great book that you have published, Discovery of India, just 2 years before. And we need to have much more solid engagement with.
Good.
So much.
So
Yeah,
I think
Professor.
it's a good turn. So from political to methodological, I think that's a good way of putting
Yeah,
it.
but methodological can also be political. But I'm just saying this.
I think, yeah, but I can also come from the different angle to join this debate, which is an interesting debate anyway. One of the important aspects of Ambedkar's persuasion in scholarship and politics is to actually engage following the historical conventions of actually participating in the debate, which is centered around a particular theme, like Kshatriya. Everybody wants to become a Kshatriya during that time, you know? So he has to actually enter there, and he can't just avoid or escape from that particular historical compulsions. And so that is one way of looking at it. You know, that's why you find who are the Shudras, like the central theme is that they are Kshatriyas. You know. So and then it follows in Karnataka the Adi Dravida, oh no, Adi Dravidas actually want, they are claiming through their narratives that they were the part of the Brahmins, as you know. So I think this goes against what Phule was saying. Actually, Phule was anti-Sanskritization scholar. So, but for certain historical reasons of protocols, historical protocols and conventions, and he actually had to use the term that he wouldn't have used for building of emancipatory trajectory. But then it is a part of that particular text and the texts that are actually operating within a historical time. But he is not actually making a fetish of it, you know, as Hari has said. No, methodology is actually deployed to actually driven out to drive out the fetish. It doesn't become a fetish. So that is an important argument one can actually forward. The second point is also important, as far as I can see, that what is the role of myths and metaphors in building up metaphor? I mean, in building up the emancipatory thought process or ideas. I think you require to also think with the people through metaphor and myths, and this is very prominent in the Western traditions, European tradition basically, and Fule's myth of Baliraja and all that is it's so finite and so powerful and so powerful, cognitively powerful, to demobilize people from the Brahmanical tradition. So I think at some point in time, when you are launching a struggle for your own understanding and emancipation, you need to take recourse to such alternatives that are available and that can really give you some lead, and in the absence of the pressure of the reason. So that is what is important in terms of these two texts. I think. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you so much again, Professor Guru. So I think, I had more questions, but because of the paucity of time, I think we'll move on to the Q&A with the audience. So there are already a couple of questions here. I'll just read them out. So Harshvardhan is asking, thank you both speakers for their preliminary statement, are very dense and needs further elaboration. Professor Rodrigues has been requested to please elaborate on Ambedkar's method of critique with respect to the nation and how it relates to his notion of truth. So Professor Rodrigues, yeah.
Yeah. Quickly, because it's good to listen to Gopal. These are big questions. The two things. Ambedkar thought that Ambedkar wrote an entire book on the idea of nation and commented on the idea of the nation continuously, although he was also wary of the idea of nationalism. But Ambedkar thought that nationalism is something which is going to swamp us whether we like it or not. And but this is not something which is given, but people would be driven to do that, wherein they would actually begin to feel a bond of kith and kin across people, that we feel that we constitute a people who are bound together through thick ties. This thick ties is quite important for Ambedkar. So a nation which is not prepared to undertake programs wherein this bond is going to be strengthened has little in justification. Now, this is, I feel, is a big idea. He is critical of it, but he thinks that it is going to be there. But he also builds up fantastic connectivities of this idea with two other ideas. That is, one, the idea of fraternity, and he often compares the idea of nationalism with the idea of fraternity, as if fraternity should be the qualifier to the idea of nationalism rather than the other way about, and the idea of democracy almost as co-evil. Yeah, co-evil. You know. So a nation justifies itself by building fraternal bonds, and it justifies itself by creating and sustaining a democracy, which is not which definitely not merely electoral democracy or constitutional democracy, but much more than that. Now, coming to truth, I think it's a very complex understanding, and anyone who is familiar today on theories of nationalism would have to read Ambedkar with regard to the insights that he actually proposes with regard to this idea. And the other one is about truth. Ambedkar thought that truth is a function of intersubjective critical engagement. And therefore, democracy becomes the theater where the idea of truth is pursued. Truth is always something which is not complete. Therefore, he agreed, I think, with this idea of jigyasu to a great extent. Somebody who is in search, but the search is never complete. But you always establish grounds of agreements and commonality on the basis of which further steps can be built. Thank you.
Professor Guru, since you've also written on this theme, I mean, your article "Nationalism as the Framework for Dalit Self-Realization," one, like from the question that was put forth to Professor Rodrigues, I also want to pursue that question of the nation further. And of course, we know the importance of fraternity in Ambedkar's theory of the nation. But I wanted to ask, how do we distinguish the notion of fraternity and something that we are depressingly witness to in the contemporary era, where everyone is also supposed to share in an identity of a particular religion, for instance, or a particular politicized religious identity. So in that sense, is it a projection of fraternity if everybody is supposed to share in that politicized religious identity? So could you maybe parse through this whole notion of Ambedkar's view of fraternity and how he wants to distinguish it from other kinds of forced ideas of nationality and identity that were also current and are current today as well?
Yeah. Okay. So let's say the equating. Some kind of reconfiguration of nationalist idea is important, and it's not simply it is not simply the question of seeking independence from the foreign rule and defining nationalism so singularly in terms of the freedom from the imperialist. as Vali has rightly pointed out, that there is a normative angle to the understanding of nationalism. It has to be actually posited against the normative values, Maitri, and I would say Maitri, not fraternity, because Maitri is much more, much deeper engagement. It actually conveys a much deeper understanding of humanity. So I think, so nation which is based on nationalism, which promotes nation which is based on Maitri, and Maitri actually demolishing the barriers between two people or between two communities or two groups is actually is constitutive of a very decent nation, and nationalism has to be driven in terms of this normative value. The other point I wanted to also add was that the truth for Ambedkar within the framework of nationalism is something which is related to power, and power actually exhibits truth inhabits in power. And therefore, where is truth? Truth actually is simultaneously present in the. There is no distinction of the nature of truth between the imperialist and the and the native socially powerful people. So truth actually is to be defined in terms of the colonial configuration of power and the local configuration of power. The Brahmins and the Baniyas and the Brahmins are the Brahmanism and capitalism. These are two forces that actually want to be powerful, and after the imperialists are gone, they remain powerful. So it's not the question of simply defining truth in terms of driving out people, but also dealing with the people who are inside. So I think truth and power that has been the concern of Phule and down to Ambedkar and many others, but more centrally Ambedkar. So that's the truth question that we can. But that question doesn't really figure into the nationalist historians. So they may be any variety, but that doesn't really figure. But subalterns will always raise the question of local configuration of power, but outside this.
So Yashwant is asking, within the interpretation of Shudra history in the domain of Kshatriyahood, how can we de-Brahmanize Shudras? And Professor Rodrigues and Professor Guru both can, I think, chime in on this question. Professor Rodrigues, you want to answer this?
Yeah, 2 or 3, just quickly. The first one is what Ambedkar thought, reinforcing democracy. Reinforcing democracy will have a cascading impact, not merely constitutional, but democracy as a way of life would have a cascading impact. And Brahmins, of course, would have to be prepared to receive critique if they want to be part of democracy. And Shudras have to listen to others if they want to outgrow their frameworks. It's the first quick response. The second one, I'm developing, of course, definitely critical reason in society. The second one, which is quite important to me and which he develops very strongly in Pakistan or partition of India, is the distinction that he makes between community and nation. And here the argument is important because he thought that communities have a way of life which is autonomous, and a nation has to respect it and see the logic of the relationship of community. Otherwise, it can prove definitely a major irritation to the idea of the nation itself. And the second one is communities do not ask for separate nationhood, but they want to have their point of view be recognized within the polity. Now, this is quite different from the struggles of nationalities who want to constitute themselves as independent states. I thought that this distinction that he makes is quite important, particularly in countries like India, where I think there are deep diversities. And these deep diversities are woven not merely in the Rawlsian sense of outcome of freedoms, but they are woven around distinct cultures, values, and frames of looking at the world. And new groupings are coming up all the time, claiming themselves as communities, and they need to be recognized as communities till the point when they tend to dissolve themselves, probably, or keep on living together with the nation.
Yeah.
Professor Guru,
Yeah,
in
I think,
addition,
I mean, this is Yashwant's question is a question which is a pedagogical question. How to de-Brahmanize. But first of all, we have to take into consideration what is Brahmanism. It is just the slogan. And there is a historical unity around this word as a slogan. I mean, this is self-defeating. I mean, it's not a will question. It's a question that you have to take lead from yourself. You have to take lead from yourself. Your own initiative, moral initiative becomes so important. And for that, I think you have to develop the ability to self-critic. Now, this is true across. The need for self-critic is the universal need, actually. And so no one is free from this. There's no bottom. Everybody is so much arranged on this on the framework of hierarchy that Brahmanism has permeated. Actually, as the Dumo said, is substantiated across castes. So how do you do it? And it is not affecting people in equal degree. It is affecting people in different degrees. That's why you feel so comfortable living in Brahmanism. And so how do you do this? Is there you will have to ask this question: in what sense, to what extent this word called Brahmanism will actually mature or accumulate my tension against the system? Now, it doesn't really happen, because as just like a capitalist ideology, Brahmanism also is very smart. Actually doesn't give you total frustration. Actually it gives you some release. So I think there's a discursive move involved in Brahmanism. Unless you actually understand this with the sense urgency of self-criticism, I will not be able to find very easy, straightforward, straight-jacketed answer to demobilize people from Brahmanism. And there are people who are actually doing it. And this is a hysterical cry, I would say. There's nothing will be produced out of this. It's a very depressing answer I'm giving, but that's true, as far as I can see it.
Yeah, thank you. The next question is by Arvind. So he's asking, is Ambedkar's use of Bhakti tradition a strategy to refute the criticisms that he was not well read or adequately aware about diverse Hindu traditions? Can it be seen as a reply to Gandhi's, sort of charge against him? This is because he densely engaged with Buddhism, but not with Bhakti in terms of his writing. Professor Rodrigues has already argued that two of his texts should be seen methodologically rather than substantially. I think some of these points have already been responded to by both the speakers in their initial remarks. But Professor Rodrigues and Guru, do you want to say anything more about Ambedkar's relationship with Bhakti?
Just one or two sentences, unless Gopal wants to come in first. But Bhakti was something which is given to Ambedkar as part of his life. What you're talking about, because Ramji Sakbal insisted that these children grow up in the Bhakti tradition, and therefore reciting from the Varkari saints, from Kabir, or even from other lores was part of the family lore. And I don't know about Ambedkar's readings of the Bhakti traditions, the way scholars read, but this is something which is nurtured from within as part of your growing up as a child. Ambedkar rebels partly, and biographers tell us a little bit about it, how he rebels, but it is part of his tradition. Like Christianity or Catholicism, for instance. I might, you know, I might be critical of it, but it is part of my grooming up. Yeah.
There is no instrumentalism in all his approach to bhakti. I mean, it was actually embedded into his own consciousness, social consciousness, and so you just can't separate the intellectual from the social, or any spiritual from the social. It is already embedded. It's a part of it. You are living with that consciousness. You don't need to actually separately demonstrate it, as Vali has rightly pointed out, and so I think so when you are actually your concern is to actually build up a system of criticality. You need to actually summon to your command all the resources that are available, and resources that are actually very easily available through the folklore traditions, or resources from Warkari traditions. And actually he goes across Maharashtra and also uh, tries to borrow from other bhakti traditions as well. I mean the other bhakti traditions. Therefore, I think his epistemic resources are already available in the traditions, which are immediately and easily available at the doorstep almost, as his family was actually very much engrossed into these bhakti traditions. And his surrounding in Varali, in that BDD Charles, was actually all the mandals will be playing bhakti saint music there. So I think he couldn't really escape at all. And he, not that he wanted to escape, but he thought it was very necessary historically to actually uh, uh, not make use, but to actually associate himself with this, because that is how that forms a part of the common sense of the people. And how can you go against the grain? It is historically foolish to go against the grain. And he realized that. He was very historically aware person for understanding the rhythms of history, dynamics and rhythms of history. Yeah.
There's one question from Monica, and she's asking about the theoretical significance of Ambedkar for Dalit political discourse. Because in her view, Dalit theorization has been a gray area for many academicians. So how can we counter that with the help of Ambedkar?
Yeah.
Professor Rodrigues, you want to answer this?
Um, Again, this is a huge question. That is the relationship between Dalit politics and Baba Saheb Ambedkar. And there are a lot of people who have reflected on at some stage when I was getting introduced to Ambedkar, people were talking about Beyond Ambedkar. There is a title, big book, Gopal would remember, which was written. And
Yes.
yeah, so, but nobody, I think, from people who are reflecting on this problem, I still feel have not gone much beyond Baba Saheb Ambedkar, except the critical tradition helps us to connect him to much larger issues and begin to emphasize things here and there. But I feel that mm, it's just one thing. I don't want to say much on this. I think Dalit politics need to bring a great deal of learning of our times on the movement on Dalit politics. It can never be, it can succeed to some extent in terms of carving out a niche for itself. And here I have always agreed with Gopal that Dalit emancipation as human emancipation constitutes the stepping stone for human emancipation as such. So, if that is the case, I think we need to bring the best that is available to us to bring on Dalit politics rather than build our own small dukan. And here I think Marx's suggestion about how the working classes can liberate themselves only by bringing, Marx and of course Lenin later on repeats it, the best knowledge and understanding of reality to come to bear on their movement is absolutely important, even for Dalit politics to break ground. And also this emotive, what Gopal called Maitri, emotive bonding and moral disposition, which is required for the purpose.
Just to add a line to this, I would invite people to read this new book, The Spheres of Injustice. The Dalit politics and feminist politics of the subaltern has to necessarily start from the negative, not from the positive, not from the tautological, but from the immediate, dialogical, not from the tautological, but dialogical. I'm just making difference. I'm just throwing these binaries so that you can engage with these binaries. Just to say a word about this, why it is not possible for a Dalit or anybody, a woman or anybody, to start theorizing Dalit politics from the negative conceptual vocabulary, like injustice, for example. Is there a theory of injustice at all? And that's the point that we are discussing in this sphere of injustice. So I think we are being arrogant to the Western scholarship. Why not? But arrogance is justified in terms of the capacity and the force of the argument. It is not simply a slogan or a vacuous cry. It is there. So I think it is. But then, Vadi, you must have you just forgot that one of the seminars you said that the credit of throwing up democracy word has to go to the Dalit movements. All the yeah. Absolutely. So I think no one has actually, it says vanity, but no one has actually thought about it. Democracy was an unwelcome thing for India, and that is what Sumit Sarkar has mentioned in his. So democracy, actually, the credit for the word democracy has to go to the struggles, equality, democracy, justice, because all these concepts were actually very, very prominent to the struggle of the Dalits. And so I think, but we are so the Dalit politics in the contemporary time has become so depressingly hopeless that it doesn't really actually think about its own resources that it created once upon a time. So it is ignorant and what I would say it is innocent and ignorant about its own resources. Innocently ignorant, I would say, just to be charitable to them. Yeah.
I'm still to get hold of your book.
Yeah, I have not got my own book, so it's just the advertisement that Ankit shared with me today.
We have time for two more questions. So Bhupender is asking, in the contemporary discourse and politics around decolonization in the global south, I was wondering whether we can see Ambedkar's tradition of critique in the same methodology and framework of decolonization. So Professor Rodrigues, you want to answer this?
A couple of just reflections. One is while the domain of political engagement of Baba Saheb Ambedkar largely remained within the frame of India, and he engaged to a great extent the big debates that were occurring in the national theater. look at the arguments that he makes. And if arguments have power, I think they reach out to a large number of people, those who are marginal, those who are deprived, those who are humiliated across the world. I think, therefore, the global south, if that term can be wrenched out of the present regime, to which some of my colleagues also have subscribed and begun to be seen as working towards a different world, a better world, rather than a power game. I think Ambedkar begins to be central to that. I don't think there is somebody who is bigger, more resourceful than Ambedkar with regard to talking to this large problem which exists with us and begin to come up in new forms all the while. So I think we need to reopen this issue of Ambedkar's reach out to a very different world, particularly a world which has never seen a space for itself through Ambedkar in very different ways. And here I think it is much more than methodological. I think the philosophical grounding of Babasaheb Ambedkar becomes absolutely important for us. Because the kind of Buddhism that he creates, I think we need to pay a little more attention to that Buddhism. And it has the capacity to reach out to the much larger world than getting it destroyed through this ritualization that is increasingly taking place. So I think we need to take Babasaheb Ambedkar to the world, in particularly to global south. I'm very unhappy about this term, particularly after the present regime thought about it. But otherwise, in the original sense in which it was initially proposed, I think Ambedkar becomes one of the, if not the decisive foundation for recreating the world.
Yeah, I think it's, I should also come in for a quick response. That taking Ambedkar around the globe is one aspiration. But is it really inspirational? So I'm making a distinction between inspirational and aspiration. What do I mean by inspirational? I think Ambedkar will become inspirational when you actually locate his universalizability in the particular. Just to say simply that how we actually universalized him within India. Forget about taking him to global south and north, all that. But how we really made any sincere efforts to actually make him universalizable, though his ideas are universalizable, but he doesn't succeed. And we are in a great hurry to take him to global south, to other things. But objectively speaking, I think we will like Hegel's owl will be flying into the dark only. So that is when the owl is, what is that famous phrase, Greek painting. Yeah. So I think we should avoid. Let's first of all find out how universal he becomes at the local particular level, and therefore the particular itself will become universal automatically. Yeah, there are different versions of what is universal anyway. We will not debate that point at this moment. But I have a very provocative response to this very inspirational, aspirational question.
Yeah. Professor Guru and Professor Rodrigues, there are two more questions. So only based on your approval, I'll take them in case we have more time. So very quickly, can I take these two questions?
Yeah, you can take, but I'm quite interested about Karnataka elections. But
yeah.
So Manju is asking, could you please reflect on the aesthetics of Ambedkar's critique? So the aesthetics aspect has been asked to elaborate it. Yeah.
I think Gopal is the best person to do because he has written extensively on.
No, not really. This Manju is from Delhi, it seems, our friend, it seems. What is so aesthetic about Ambedkar's critique of a critique of the establishment or the, or any other ideological formation that trample down on the dignity of the people? So it is the moment you actually expose or discover the limits of the opponents, aesthetic automatically becomes available. It becomes attached. So I think aesthetic is not to be found in the expansion or elaboration of or description of the or laying down or mapping out of the positions that the opponents have taken, but to actually pointing out the limits of that particular thing is also beautiful. Second point is that if you are actually trying to put history in a very dry mechanical format, history of, for example, exploitation, history of discrimination, that will not have any aesthetic sense to it, because there are certain norms, standards that actually decide what is the aesthetic framework of a particular discourse. Now, if you think that one has to abide by the historical conventions, and as I mentioned, the protocols, the kind of language he's using is not his private language. Is the language which is actually endorsed by the discourse which he wants to subvert. As subversion, it becomes aesthetically so sound. So the critic becomes aesthetic because it is actually using, it is innovating. Innovation itself is so beautiful. Critic automatically acquires the aesthetic power, and power itself becomes so beautiful in a way. Power shouldn't become aesthetically sound and beautiful and attractive, but in this case, the way he argues, the way he actually demolishes not right, but here the way he actually pursues is so beautiful with Gandhi. The persuasion, the ethical is also aesthetic in a sense that you are actually being so nice, gentle, decent to your opponent that you are not actually using any militaristic vocabulary to actually demolish the person. But there are several ways of looking at it, but this is what it is. And when he is actually quoting Tukaram, wonderful. It's just wonderful. Just wonderful. Yeah.
Just to add one line to that, there is a Dalit aesthetics already in place, and it is important to engage with it and to make it to outgrow its limitations.
Yeah.
Particularly in the folklore of this country.
Yes. Yeah.
And Gopal has done some work there, very important work. Long ago, you might have forgotten now. But in Karnataka, I see it constantly how folk life and folk aesthetics has strong elements of how to live. And I was inspired by Sharmila Rodrigues' work in this direction. She went about responding to some of these dimensions in her writings.
Just to put a not disclaimer, but information of some of Sharmila Rodrigues' articles on precisely this question have been published in EPW as well. So like the listeners are very much pointed towards those articles in our archives. So the last question that we'll take for today is from Rajat. So he's asking, how does Ambedkar critique and retrieve tradition at the same time? Buddhism and Bhakti, can these two be placed on the same pedestal? Can the exit or the negative vocabulary of this tradition sit comfortably with the Bhakti tradition, which quite often has been appropriated within the Brahminical episteme or as part of protective discoloration, to use Ambedkar's words? Professor Rodrigues, if you can answer this question.
I think just is again, like Rajat Roy has always asked, these are large questions, but a quick response. I think Baba Sahib Ambedkar, in several of his writings, particularly in the Buddha and his Dhamma, offers us a scale or a paradigm, if you want to use that term, of how to negotiate through the cultural baggage we are part of, including the kind of spaces people carve out for themselves, such as caste. And I think he is very sensitive about at least 4 dimensions. One is very strong stress on reasonableness. The second, very strong stress that there is something called moral, which is foundational to human existence. And my being is very much caught up with those of others. And the third one, where he actually began to talk, for people to become themselves, you need to have certain basics in place. And the last one, any kind of charity and patronizing is not going to be helpful. So there is a parameter, he puts it down, and he puts it in the mouth of the Buddha. And I think it can be a sort of a sieve through which we are going to process what is desirable and what is not desirable, including the Bhakti traditions.
Yeah.
And of course, a very strong assertion of this world, which is contained in the idea of the reason, assertion of this world rather than making people to be comfortable in the world to come.
Yeah, thank you, Rajat. I'll just come in for a minute, for a second. That the tradition, which is a descending tradition starting from Buddha, Kabir, Phule, Tukaram, you find that Buddha actually appears, makes not the guest appearance, but the very serious appearance both in Kabir, Buddha, Tukaram, and Phule, and down to Ambedkar. So there is a continuous thread in all that. So, but the point that you're raising is that how does one accommodate negative? Because these are all positive, which is not the case. Actually, Phule's is a very negative language. Gulamgiri, one example, just one example. It may not be so so prominent in Kabir, but of course it is very much present in the Tukaram, and he's charged with that negative vocabulary. And in Phule, of course, is definitely charged with negative. But the point that you're raising is that how to actually accommodate this. So I think why do they require? I mean, these people are so perceptive, all these thinkers, leaders, Phule, they are so perspective and so conscious that they know that in the radical consciousness of the people, what comes to their mind first is not the positive but the negative. And your own language in Bangla, people say abhav. No, injustice is done to me, then justice. So injustice is come on priority. So, but we need to, our job is to theorize what is this injustice, why does it arrive at immediately after the atrocity is done to a person. So that has not been done because it is already assumed in the tautological social theory of justice of Rawls and others. So we required to theorize this injustice or abha or anyaya or whatever as the initial primary theoretical condition, not the absolute. Everybody wants justice. Even if somebody wants to go beyond justice. So I think this is the initial thing. So we'll have to start at least doing that. And who can do it? Not those who are established scholars sitting in the West, but we who are sitting in Bangalore and Pune and and Calcutta and other places. Okay, this is the homework I'm giving you, Rajat. Please take it. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Professor Guru and Professor Rodriguez, for this absolutely enriching discussion. I mean, there are so many questions that come to my own mind, but I'll put a halt to them in the interest of time. We've already overstepped by 3 or so minutes. So I'll thank both of you again for your tremendous patience and forbearance in answering all of our questions and queries with so much eloquence and fluency and density of thought as well. So just a brief vote of thanks of sorts for the engaged team, especially Divya, Priyam, Johan, Tia, and Akanksha, who made the very nice poster for the event, who have been very active in contacting and managing everything to do with all the events that we organize on behalf of Economic and Political Weekly. So a big thanks to them. And again, a big thanks to Professor Rodriguez, who has been a regular contributor to EPW, and I'm sure will continue to contribute more to the journal in the form of his writings and such appearances on our engage events.
We'll invite Professor Rodriguez to really to contribute in different ways to EPW.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks so much for your time. Yeah.
Thank you. Professor Guru, you want to say something at the end?
No. I just I just wanted to thank Professor Rodriguez for taking out time and sharing his important views on the topic. Actually, he's the one who actually started this critic thing around long back. So we have not come full circle. We still want to do some more work on this count, and we'll have enough time and opportunity in the future. Yeah. Thank you so much, Vali, for this. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Thank you
So
so
with that, I would like to
and
end.
we should also thank the people who ask questions. So they are very
Yes,
perceptive
absolutely.
questions. Actually, for the first time, I must say, share with Professor Valerian Rodrigues that we got very, very intelligent. I'm sorry, not very perceptive questions. Yeah.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah. So of
Yeah.
course, yeah, a big thanks to all the audience members as well as and especially the people who asked these very insightful questions to both of our speakers. So with that, I'd like to end today's webinar. Hope to see you in the next event that we organize.
Stay safe and thank you so much. Okay, bye.
Thank you so much. Yeah.